The war had consumed 3 generations of humanity, and Commander Jake Morrison carried that burden like iron chains wrapped around his soul because his brother died on the frozen moon of Epsilon Prime when elven raiders burned the human settlement to ashes and left nothing but silence and snow-stained red with innocent blood. Jake stood on the bridge of the battleship Defiance and watched the stars streak past in endless ribbons of light as they traveled through hyperspace toward the contested zone where humans and elves fought over planets that neither race had originally called home, but both now claimed with weapons and fury. His hands gripped the railing until his knuckles turned white, and Captain Holland stood beside him reviewing tactical displays that showed enemy positions scattered across 3 star systems like drops of poison in clear water. And Jake felt the familiar rage building in his chest whenever he thought about the pointed ears and silver hair and violet eyes of the species that had stolen his brother from him. The mission briefing had been simple enough because they were supposed to intercept an elven supply convoy near the Viridian system and cut off resources flowing to their forward bases, but intelligence reports were always incomplete, and battles never went according to plan, as Jake had learned through 15 years of service in the human fleet. He touched the worn photograph in his breast pocket without pulling it out because he had memorized every detail of his brother standing in front of their childhood home on Earth, with that crooked smile and messy brown hair and eyes full of dreams about exploring the galaxy before the elves taught humanity that the universe was not a place of wonder but a battlefield where only the strong survived. The ship lurched suddenly and alarms screamed through the corridors in waves of red light and harsh sound as something massive struck their shields and sent crew members stumbling against walls and equipment, and Jake heard Holland shouting orders to return fire and evasive maneuvers, but it was already too late. Through the viewport, Jake saw the elven warships emerging from behind the planet like sharks rising from dark water, and their weapons glowed with that distinctive blue energy that humans had learned to fear and hate in equal measure, because it cut through armor like paper and left nothing but destruction in its wake. The battle lasted 17 minutes according to the chronometer, but felt like hours as Jake coordinated fighter squadrons and watched good men and women die in bursts of light against the black canvas of space. And he felt each loss like a physical blow, because these were his people, and his responsibility and his family in all the ways that mattered. His fighter squadron leader, Lieutenant Amy Chen, reported 3 confirmed kills before her signal went dead, and Jake did not let himself think about her 2 children waiting on Mars Station or her husband who served on another ship 3 systems away, because grief was a luxury the commanders could not afford in the middle of battle. The Defiance took critical damage to the port engine and began listing as secondary explosions, rippled through the lower decks, and Holland made the call to abandon ship because staying meant death for everyone aboard, and Jake felt rage and shame burning together in his throat as he ran toward the escape pods. He sealed his flight suit and grabbed emergency supplies from the locker, because training took over when conscious thought failed, and he climbed into his personal fighter craft that was docked in the small bay reserved for command staff, and punched the launch sequence with shaking hands. The fighter shot out into space just as the Defiance exploded behind him in a ball of fire that lit up the darkness like a dying star, and Jake did not look back, because looking back meant accepting that hundreds of people he knew and served with were gone in an instant, and he could not afford that acceptance yet. His navigation systems flickered and died as shrapnel from the explosion tore through his fighter, and Jake wrestled with the controls trying to stabilize his trajectory, but the ship was falling toward the planet below, and gravity was an enemy more patient and inevitable than any elven warrior. He managed to angle the nose up slightly as he hit the atmosphere, and the fighter became a meteor trailing fire across the purple sky, and Jake braced for impact while his mind raced through emergency procedures that seemed inadequate against the reality of falling from orbit in a dying ship. The crash threw him forward against his restraints hard enough to crack ribs and split skin, and when the world stopped spinning, he tasted blood in his mouth and felt warm liquid running down his face from a deep gash across his forehead that turned his vision red. Jake unbuckled with clumsy fingers and kicked open the damaged canopy and dragged himself out onto sand that was the wrong color, purple instead of the tan or gold of Earth deserts, and 2 moons hung in the sky above him like watching eyes, and everything hurt in ways that made breathing difficult and thinking even harder. He collapsed beside the smoking wreckage and tried to assess his injuries, but the medical scanner on his wrist was cracked and useless, so he had to rely on touch and pain to understand that he had broken ribs and a possible concussion and lacerations that would need treatment soon, or infection would kill him slower than the crash. The planet was listed as uninhabited in the database, which meant no rescue was coming quickly because search teams would focus on more populated areas first, and Jake would have to survive on his own with limited supplies and unknown threats on a world that humans had barely explored. He forced himself to stand, even though his body protested with waves of agony, and he pulled the emergency pack from the fighter wreckage and checked its contents to find water purification tablets and protein bars, and a basic medical kit, and a plasma pistol with 2 charge packs. The sound reached him before he saw anything, and it cut through his pain like a knife through flesh, because it was a cry of pure terror and desperation that transcended language and species and touched something deep in his human soul that responded to fear and anguish regardless of who made the sound. Jake turned and saw her through the haze of pain and shock, and she was running across the dunes with silver hair streaming behind her like liquid moonlight, and those pointed ears that marked her as his enemy and his brother's killer, even though logic said she personally had done nothing wrong. She stumbled and fell to her knees perhaps 50 meters away, and from her shoulders came 2 small creatures that Jake initially thought were birds, but then he saw the scales and tiny wings, and realized they were dragons no bigger than cats with colors that shifted between blue and green like tropical waters. Behind her came the hunters, and Jake recognized them from intelligence briefings as Krell, which were one of the few species that both humans and elves feared because they were efficient killers who hunted anything with warm blood and showed no mercy or intelligence beyond the drive to feed. The woman tried to shield the baby dragons with her own body and raised one hand in what looked like a final gesture of love toward the creatures she protected, and Jake felt something break inside his chest because he saw not an elf, but a mother, and not an enemy, but someone who would die for those she loved. His hand moved to the plasma pistol before his conscious mind made the decision, and he raised the weapon with shaking arms and fired 3 shots that turned the lead Krell into ash and caused the others to turn toward him with their dead black eyes reflecting nothing but hunger. Jake kept firing as they charged toward him across the purple sand, and each shot took effort because his injuries screamed protest, but he did not stop because something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the universe, and he could not let this woman die even if she was elven. The last Krell fell smoking to the sand, and Jake collapsed to his knees as the plasma pistol slipped from his fingers, and his vision tunneled to a narrow point of light surrounded by darkness, and he wondered if he had finally pushed his broken body too far beyond its limits. He expected nothing from the elf woman, because why would she help someone whose people had been killing hers for 3 generations, and whose uniform marked him clearly as an enemy combatant? But she surprised him by rushing toward him instead of fleeing while she had the chance. Her hands were gentle as she knelt beside him and examined his wounds with careful fingers that probed the gash on his forehead and the way he held his ribs, and she spoke in a language that flowed like water over stones with sounds that human vocal cords were not designed to make. The baby dragons climbed onto his shoulders, making small chirping noises that reminded him oddly of the parakeets his mother had kept in their kitchen when he was young, before the war, before his brother died, before everything good in the universe seemed to burn away, leaving only ash and anger. Jake tried to speak, but his mouth was too dry and his tongue felt thick, so he just looked up at her and saw tears streaming down her face, leaving tracks through the dust on her cheeks, and her violet eyes were filled with gratitude and disbelief. In equal measure, she pressed both palms against his chest, right over his heart, and warmth spread through him like sunrise breaking over a frozen landscape, and he realized she was using some kind of healing magic that elves possessed, but humans had never fully understood, because the 2 species had spent more time killing each other than learning from each other. The pain began to fade, not disappearing completely but becoming manageable, and the bleeding from his forehead slowed to a trickle, and Jake felt strength returning to his limbs along with a strange tingling sensation that made his skin feel alive in ways it had not for years. The woman helped him stand and supported his weight as they walked away from the crash site and the dead Krell bodies, and she kept looking back over her shoulder as if expecting more threats to emerge from the purple dunes that stretched in all directions under the twin moons. She led him to a cave hidden in an outcropping of black rock that looked like volcanic glass, and inside, she'd created a small camp with supplies scattered around and a fire that burned with blue flames that gave off heat but no smoke, and cast strange shadows on the rough walls. Jake sank down onto a bedroll that felt softer than anything made by human hands, and watched as she moved around the cave gathering items and speaking softly to the baby dragons who had followed them inside and now curled up near the fire with their tails intertwined. She brought him water in a metal cup that had elven symbols etched around the rim, and the liquid tasted cleaner and sweeter than anything from his ship's recyclers, and he drank deeply while she watched with concern in those alien violet eyes. Then she offered food that looked like thin wafers in various colors, and when he bit into one cautiously, it tasted like honey and bread and something else he could not identify, but it filled his stomach and gave him energy, and he realized he had not eaten since before the battle. The baby dragons crept closer as he ate, and one of them, the one with more blue, in its scales touched his hand with its nose and made a soft trilling sound, and Jake found himself reaching out slowly to stroke its head, and the scales felt like warm velvet over something harder underneath. The woman smiled for the first time, and pointed to herself and said a word that sounded like Laura, though he was not certain his human ears heard it correctly, and Jake repeated it, and she nodded enthusiastically, and pointed to him with a questioning expression. He said his name, and she tried to repeat it, but the sounds came out slightly wrong in her mouth, and they both almost laughed at the attempt before remembering they were supposed to be enemies, and the moment turned awkward as the reality of their situation pressed. Back and through gestures and simple words and drawings scratched in the sand of the cave floor, they began to communicate. And Jake learned that she had been a researcher studying ancient dragon eggs at a dig site on her home world before the war. Came and destroyed everything. She showed him images on a small holographic device that projected scenes of elven cities, with towers that spiraled up toward purple skies, and forests that glowed with bioluminescent life, and families gathered around, tables laden with food. And it all looked peaceful and beautiful in ways that contradicted everything Jake had been taught about the elven people. Then she showed him the same cities burning with human warships overhead, raining fire down on civilian populations and children running through streets screaming and families torn apart. And Jake felt something twist inside his chest because these were the same stories humans told about elven attacks, but from the other perspective. She had fled with only the dragon eggs, which were the last of their kind from an ancient genetic line, and she had managed to keep them alive and hidden for months, while moving from planet to planet, always one step ahead of the fighting until the eggs finally hatched. 3 weeks ago, the baby dragons were all she had left of her old life, and she protected them with everything she possessed, because they represented hope and continuity, and the possibility that something beautiful could survive even in a universe. Torn apart by war, Jake found himself telling her about his brother through halting words and gestures, and the photograph he pulled from his pocket, with creased edges and faded colors, and she looked at the image for a long time before touching it gently with one finger and saying something in her language that sounded like a prayer or blessing. They sat in silence for a while with only the crackling of the blue fire and the soft breathing of the sleeping dragons, and Jake felt the weight of 15 years of hatred pressing down on him like a physical force. But now it felt different because he could no longer pretend the elves were monsters instead of people. Laura moved closer and took his hand in hers, and her skin was warm and smooth, and she traced the scars on his knuckles from old fights and old wounds and looked up at him with eyes that held questions he did not know how to answer. He wanted to tell her that he was sorry for everything his people had done to hers, and that he understood now that war made victims of everyone regardless of which side they fought for. But the words stuck in his throat, because apologies felt inadequate against the scale of the suffering. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently, and she squeezed back, and in that simple gesture, they formed a fragile bridge across the chasm that separated their species. And Jake felt something shift inside himself, like ice breaking up after a long winter. The bolder of the two dragons woke and climbed into his lap and curled up like a cat, and began making a sound that resembled purring, and Jake stroked its scales and felt amazed that something so small and delicate had survived in the middle of a war zone. Laura leaned her head against his shoulder, and exhaustion finally claimed them both as they sat together in the cave with the blue fire burning low. and the baby dragons sleeping peacefully. And for the first time in 15 years, Jake did not dream of his brother dying, but of silver hair and violet eyes and the possibility that maybe hatred was not the only choice. Jake woke to sunlight filtering through the cave entrance in shades of orange and gold that reminded him of Earth dawns from his childhood. And for a moment before memory returned, he felt peaceful, in a way he had not experienced since before the war consumed his life. Laura was already awake, tending to the baby dragons who chirped and tumbled over each other near the blue fire that somehow still burned, though Jake had not seen her add fuel during the night, and he wondered about the technology or magic that sustained it. She looked over at him and smiled and handed him more of the wafer food and water, and Jake ate while watching her interact with the dragons, and noticed how her movements were graceful, even in simple tasks, like smoothing their scales or checking their small wings for damage. His injuries felt better than they had any right to after only one night. And when he probed his ribs carefully, he found they were tender, but no longer sharp with agony, and the gash on his forehead had sealed itself, though he could feel the raised line of new scar tissue. Laura gestured for him to follow her outside, and they emerged into a landscape that took his breath away, because the purple sand stretched to distant mountains that gleamed like copper in the morning light, and the sky was a shade of green he had never seen before, with clouds that moved in spirals. She led him to a high point where they could see for kilometers in all directions, and Jake realized they were looking for threats or rescue, or perhaps just trying to understand where they had ended up on this strange world that neither of their people had claimed. The baby dragons flew short distances now, their wings still clumsy but growing stronger, and they chased each other through the air, making sounds of joy that seemed to transcend species, and Jake found himself smiling despite everything as he watched them play. Laura pointed to the horizon where something glinted in the distance, and Jake shaded his eyes and saw what might be structures or perhaps just unusual rock formations, but either way it represented a destination and a purpose, and they both understood without words that staying in one place meant eventually being found by forces that would not understand their fragile peace. They spent the morning gathering supplies, and Laura showed him plants that were safe to eat, and a spring hidden in the rocks where water bubbled up clear and cold and tasted like minerals, and ancient. Stone and Jake filled every container they had. She taught him words in her language, and he taught her words in his, and they laughed at each other's pronunciation, because humans and elves had different mouth shapes, and some sounds were simply impossible for the other species to make correctly. The boulder dragon, which Laura called something that sounded like spark, became attached to Jake and followed him everywhere, perching on his shoulder or flying ahead to scout, and then returning with pleased chirps as if reporting what it had found. The gentler dragon, whose name sounded like whisper, preferred Laura and stayed close to her, often hiding in her long silver hair or peeking out from the collar of her tunic with large eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom despite the creature's young age. By afternoon they had packed everything and began walking toward the distant structures, with the dragons flying overhead in widening circles, and Jake felt stronger with each step, though he knew his injuries would take days to fully heal even with Laura's magical assistance. They talked as they walked, and Jake learned that Laura had lived for 53 years, which shocked him until she explained that elves aged differently, and she was still considered young by her people's standards, and she laughed at his surprise in a way that was both kind and teasing. She had studied ancient history and xenobiology before the war, and her passion was understanding how different species evolved and adapted to their environments, and she spoke with excitement about the dragon eggs she had found in ruins that dated back thousands of years to a time before either humans or elves had left their home worlds. Jake told her about growing up on Earth in a small town by the ocean, and how he had wanted to be a teacher before his brother died, and how that death had changed everything and pushed him into the military, where he spent 15 years learning to kill instead of learning to build. Laura listened without judgment and asked questions that made him think about choices he had made and paths he had taken, and whether revenge had ever brought him peace or just more emptiness. And Jake found he did not have good answers. They reached the structures by evening and discovered they were ruins from some ancient civilization that had existed on this planet long before humans or elves had ever looked up at the stars and wondered what lay beyond their own atmospheres. The ruins were made of a material that looked like crystal, but felt warm to the touch, and they formed partial walls and archways that suggested buildings far more massive than anything either of their species had constructed. And Jake felt small standing among them. Laura explored with scientific curiosity, touching surfaces and examining carvings that might have been writing or art, or something else entirely, and the baby dragons flew through the archways, calling to each other with echoing voices that made the ruins feel less empty. They made camp in what might have once been a great hall with walls rising 20 meters and a ceiling that had mostly collapsed. Letting in the evening light, and Jake built a fire the human way with friction and dried plant material because they needed to conserve Laura's supplies. She sat close to him as darkness fell and the temperature dropped quickly as it did on desert worlds, and they shared warmth and food and stories, and Jake realized he was more comfortable with her than he had been with anyone in years. Laura asked about human culture and customs and what people did for joy and celebration, and Jake described holidays and music and sports and the way families gathered to share meals, and he saw her face light up because elves did similar things despite the surface differences. She told him about elven art forms that involved growing living sculptures from plants, and about musical instruments that responded to the player's emotions rather than their physical touch, and about festivals where entire cities would glow with magical light for days. The baby dragons curled up between them, and Jake and Laura found themselves holding hands again, as if it was the most natural thing in the universe, and the hate that had defined Jake's adult life felt distant, like something that had happened to a different person. He looked at her face illuminated by firelight and saw beauty, not in the alien way her features were arranged, but in the kindness in her eyes and the gentleness of her smile, and the courage it took to protect two small lives in the middle of a war that wanted to consume everything. Laura met his gaze, and something passed between them that was more than gratitude or companionship, and Jake felt his heart beat faster in a way that had nothing to do with combat or danger, and everything to do with connection. They talked deep into the night about philosophy and meaning, and whether the war could ever end, and what it would take for humans and elves to see each other as people instead of enemies, and neither of them had answers. But asking the questions felt important. Jake told her about the photograph of his brother, and how he had carried it like a talisman, against forgetting why he fought, and Laura gently suggested that perhaps his brother would want him to remember the love they shared, rather than the anger at his death. She showed him a pendant she wore hidden under her tunic, with an image of her parents who had died when their city was bombed, and she said she kept it, not to fuel hatred, but to remember that they had taught her to value life, even when the universe seemed determined to destroy it. As they finally settled down to sleep with the dragons nestled between them and the ancient ruins standing silent watch around them, Jake realized that something fundamental had changed in him, and he could never go back to being the man who had climbed into that fighter to kill elves without question or doubt. Laura whispered something in her language that he did not understand, but the tone conveyed warmth and trust, and Jake responded in his own language with words that meant the same, and they fell asleep holding hands across the small bodies of two baby dragons who represented hope in a hopeless time. The morning of the third day brought storms that rolled across the desert sky in waves of green and purple lightning that struck the sand and turned it to glass, and Jake and Laura huddled in the ruins, with the baby dragons pressed close between them while the world outside became violent and strange. Jake watched the lightning through gaps in the ancient walls and wondered if rescue would come before they ran out of supplies, or if perhaps rescue would bring its own dangers, because he was no longer certain he wanted to return to a war that suddenly seemed pointless and cruel. Laura taught him more of her language during the storm, and he learned words for concepts that humans did not have direct translations for, like the feeling of belonging to a place, or the sadness that comes from beauty passing, or the joy that exists even in difficult moments. He taught her about human ideas of honor and duty, and she listened carefully, and then asked questions that made him uncomfortable, because they exposed contradictions he had never examined, like how honor could justify killing people who also believed they were acting with honor. The baby dragons grew restless being confined, and Spark kept trying to fly out into the storm until Jake gently caught him and held him close and felt the small creature's heartbeat racing against his palm, and understood that even dragons could feel fear. Whisper stayed with Laura and made soft, worried sounds, and she sang to the small dragon, in a language that might have been even older than the elven tongue Jake was learning, and the melody was haunting and beautiful, and made him think of his mother's lullabies from childhood. When the storm finally passed, they emerged to find the landscape transformed with new patterns of glass scattered across the sand like frozen lightning, and the air smelled of ozone and something else that reminded Jake of the way space smelled when you first cycled through an airlock. They continued toward what they hoped was civilization, though neither of them could say whether they wanted to find humans or elves or perhaps neither. And Jake realized that a few days ago he would have known exactly what he wanted, but now everything was uncertain. Laura's supplies were running low and Jake's emergency rations were nearly gone, and they both knew they would need to find help soon, or the desert would claim them regardless of their growing friendship or the feelings that neither of them had quite acknowledged aloud. The baby dragons caught small lizard-like creatures that skittered across the purple sand and brought them back proudly, as if offering tribute, and Laura showed Jake which ones were safe to eat, and they cooked them over a fire that night. And the meat was tough but nourishing. Jake found himself watching Laura more often now, noticing small things like the way she pushed her silver hair behind her pointed ears when she was concentrating, or how her eyes changed shade, depending on the light or her mood or how she hummed while working with the dragons. She caught him watching once and smiled in a way that made his chest feel tight, and he looked away, embarrassed. But she reached over and touched his hand briefly, and he understood that she did not mind his attention. They talked about what would happen if they were rescued, and Jake admitted he did not know if he could return to fighting now that he had seen the person behind the enemy, and Laura said she felt the same, and they both acknowledged that their respective militaries would consider them traitors or at least compromised. Jake suggested they could find a neutral planet somewhere in unclaimed space and start over away from the war, and Laura's eyes lit up at the possibility, but they both knew it was a fantasy, because deserting meant becoming fugitives, and fugitives rarely survived long in a galaxy at war. On the fourth day, they saw ships in the sky, and Jake's heart raced as he recognized the signatures as human vessels doing a search pattern, and he knew he should signal them. But his hand hesitated over his emergency beacon, because calling them meant the end of this strange, peaceful interlude. Laura saw the ships too, and looked at Jake with fear in her violet eyes, because human forces would not treat her kindly, and the baby dragons would likely be taken for study or destroyed as potential weapons, and everything they had built together would shatter. Jake made a decision that surprised himself, and he took Laura's hand and led her and the dragons into a deep crevasse in the rocks where the ship's scanners would not easily penetrate, and they hid while the rescue teams passed overhead searching for survivors. The ships eventually moved on to other sectors, and Jake and Laura emerged into sunlight that felt different now, because he had actively chosen to hide from his own people to protect an elf, and that choice changed everything about who he was and what he believed. Laura looked at him with something like awe and gratitude and fear all mixed together, and she asked him why in halting human words, and Jake tried to explain that he could not let them take her or the dragons. But the real truth was deeper and harder to articulate. He was falling in love with her, though he barely understood how that was possible when they had known each other for only days and came from species that had been taught to hate each other. And yet his heart did not care about logic or history or the political complications. They walked for another day and found a valley with water and vegetation that was more substantial than the desert scrub, and they made camp there and discussed their options with increasing urgency because eventually someone would find them. Laura suggested she could contact her own people, but Jake knew that elven forces would view him the same way human forces would view her, and they would be separated and probably interrogated, and everything they had discovered about seeing past hatred would be lost. The baby dragons were growing quickly now, and Spark could breathe small puffs of flame that singed the air and made crackling sounds, and Whisper had developed the ability to become almost invisible when frightened by blending with whatever surface was nearby. Jake realized the dragons represented something important, beyond just being creatures to protect, because they were a species that predated the human-elf conflict, and they existed outside the hatred, and perhaps that was a lesson about how artificial and recent the animosity really was. On the evening of the fifth day, Jake and Laura sat by the water as the twin moons rose and cast silver light across the valley, and the baby dragons played in the shallows, and everything felt suspended in a moment of peace that could not last. Laura turned to him and spoke seriously about the fact that they could not hide forever, and that eventually they would have to face their respective peoples and try to explain what had happened and why two enemies had become something else. Jake agreed, but said he wanted to try to use their story to bridge the gap between humans and elves, because if people could see that connection was possible, then maybe the war could end through understanding, rather than one side destroying the other. She pointed out that most humans and elves did not want to understand each other, and that their leaders had built careers and power structures on maintaining the conflict, and that two individuals would have little influence against such massive forces. He acknowledged she was right, but said that doing nothing guaranteed nothing would change, and at least trying gave them a chance, however small. And Laura smiled sadly and said that was a very human way of thinking, but she admired it anyway. They kissed for the first time as the moons reached their highest point, and it felt like the most natural and most revolutionary thing Jake had ever done, because it was an act of creation in the middle of destruction, and an affirmation of life in the face of death. The baby dragons watched with curiosity, and Spark made an approving chirping sound, while Whisper hid shyly, but both of them seemed to understand that something important had happened, and they curled up together contentedly. Jake held Laura close and felt her heart beat against his chest, and knew that whatever came next they would face it together, and that knowledge gave him strength he had not felt since before his brother died, because he was no longer fighting alone or for abstract concepts, but for someone specific and real. Laura whispered that she loved him in her language, and then repeated it in his, and Jake said it back in both languages, and they laughed at his pronunciation, but the meaning was clear and true. Regardless of how the words sounded as they settled down to sleep, Laura asked what he thought would happen, and Jake admitted he did not know, but he believed they had found something worth protecting, even if the entire galaxy told them it was wrong. The rescue ship appeared on the 6th day, and this time there was no hiding because it landed directly in their valley, and soldiers emerged with weapons ready, and Jake knew immediately that someone had tracked his emergency beacon signal, even though he had never activated it because military technology always had backup systems. Captain Holland stepped out of the ship, and his face showed relief and then confusion, and then something darker as he saw Laura and the baby dragons and Jake standing together in a way that made it clear they were not prisoner and captor, but something else entirely. Jake stepped forward with his hands visible and non-threatening and tried to explain, but Holland cut him off and ordered Laura secured, and the dragons contained, and Jake felt rage building in his chest, because he had saved these beings and they had saved him in return. Laura moved closer to Jake, and the baby dragons flew to them and positioned themselves protectively. And Spark breathed a small jet of flame that made the soldiers step back and raise their weapons, and Jake shouted for everyone to stop before the situation escalated into violence. Holland demanded to know what had happened, and Jake told him everything about the crash and the Krell attack and how Laura had healed him and how they had survived together. And he saw Holland's expression shift from anger to something like pity mixed with disappointment. The captain said that Jake was suffering from trauma and possibly Stockholm Syndrome, and that he would receive proper medical care and counseling once they returned to base, and that the elf would be transferred to intelligence for interrogation, and the dragons would be handed over to xenobiology. Jake refused and placed himself between Laura and the soldiers and said that if they wanted to take her, they would have to go through him. And he saw shock on Holland's face, because commanders did not defy orders and certainly did not protect enemy combatants. Holland tried to reason with him and explained that fraternizing with the enemy was treason, and that Jake's career was over, and possibly his freedom and his life depending on what military tribunal decided. But Jake said some things were more important than career or freedom. Laura touched his shoulder and told him in careful human words that it was okay, and that she would go with them if it meant he would be safe. And Jake turned to her and saw tears in her violet eyes and felt his heart break because he knew what would happen to her in human custody. He looked back at Holland and made a proposal that surprised himself, even as he said it, because he suggested that instead of treating Laura as a prisoner, they could use her as an ambassador and begin peace negotiations using their survival story as evidence that humans and elves could cooperate. Holland laughed bitterly and said that both sides had tried peace talks before and they always failed because the hatred ran too deep and too many people had lost too much and vengeance mattered more than reconciliation to most of the galaxy. Jake argued that those talks had failed because they were conducted by politicians and generals who had built their identities around the conflict. But what if instead they started with individuals who had experienced the possibility of understanding and let that spread organically? The captain looked at Jake for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, because Holland had known Jake for 10 years and had served with his brother, and understood what it meant for Jake to defend an elf after everything he had lost. Holland said he would need to consult with command, and that, in the meantime, Laura would remain technically in custody, but would be treated as a guest rather than a prisoner. And the dragons could stay with her and Jake would be confined to quarters pending investigation. It was not what Jake wanted, but it was better than the alternatives, and he squeezed Laura's hand before the soldiers led her toward the ship. And she looked back at him with trust in her eyes that made him determined to find a way to protect what they had built. The journey back to the fleet took 2 days, and Jake spent most of that time in his quarters, writing reports and preparing arguments for why the military should consider a different approach to the war, based on what he had learned about elves being people, not monsters. Holland visited once and admitted that he was moved by Jake's conviction, but warned that the Admiralty would not be easily convinced, and that there were powerful forces on both sides who benefited from continued conflict and would resist any attempt at peace. Jake asked if Holland believed peace was possible, and the captain said he wanted to believe it, but that hope was dangerous when dealing with institutions built on war, and that Jake should prepare himself for disappointment and possibly worse consequences. The second evening, Laura was brought to see him under guard, and they had only minutes together, but she told him that human intelligence officers had questioned her extensively about elven military capabilities, and she had answered truthfully because she believed transparency was necessary for peace. She had also told them about the dragons being the last of an ancient species, and how both humans and elves should work together to preserve them rather than fighting over who would control them, and Jake loved her even more for thinking about the dragon's welfare in the middle of her own crisis. They held each other until the guards said time was up, and Jake whispered that he would not stop fighting for them, and Laura said she knew, and that his courage had already changed her understanding of what humans were capable of, and that alone was valuable regardless of outcome. The ship docked at Fleet Command Station, and Jake was escorted to a conference room where he faced 3 admirals and a panel of senior officers, and he recognized some of them as people who had lost family to elven attacks, and knew his argument would be difficult. He presented his case methodically, describing the crash and the rescue and the days of survival and learning to communicate and see past cultural differences. And he showed them the photograph of his brother, and explained that he had not forgotten or dishonored his memory by choosing understanding over vengeance. Admiral Victoria Hayes, who had lost her son in the war, listened carefully and asked pointed questions about whether Jake believed Laura had manipulated him psychologically, and Jake admitted it was possible, but said his feelings and observations were genuine regardless. He argued that the current strategy of total war was leading nowhere except mutual destruction, and that both species would eventually exhaust their resources and collapse, and that finding a path to peace was not weakness, but survival. The admirals deliberated for hours while Jake waited in an adjacent room, and he thought about Laura and the baby dragons, and wondered if he had done enough, or if his efforts would be dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized soldier. Admiral Hayes emerged and told him that the panel had reached a decision, and Jake braced himself for court-martial or imprisonment. But instead, she said they were willing to attempt a limited experiment in dialogue, using Jake and Laura as initial contact points. The plan was conditional and fragile because Jake would need to convince Laura's people to send representatives who were willing to talk, and both sides would need to agree to temporary ceasefire in specific sectors. And there were 1,000 ways it could fail, but it was a chance, and Jake felt hope for the first time since his brother died, because maybe something good could come from all the suffering, and maybe 2 people from enemy species falling in love was not an aberration, but a blueprint for a different future. He was allowed to see Laura and tell her about the decision, and she cried with relief and joy, and held him tightly, while the baby dragons flew circles around them, making happy chirping sounds, and Spark breathed small celebration. Flames Laura said she would contact her people and try to convince them to participate, and that she had connections to scientists and philosophers who had opposed the war from the beginning and wanted alternatives to endless fighting. Jake knew the path ahead would be difficult, and that many on both sides would resist and that they might fail. But standing with Laura and the dragons, he felt certain they had to try, because the alternative was continuing to kill each other until nothing remained. Admiral Hayes told them they had 1 week to establish communication and generate interest in talks before the experiment would be deemed a failure and normal hostilities would resume. And Jake accepted the timeline, knowing it was probably generous given military thinking. He and Laura worked together, crafting messages to influential people on both sides, and telling their story and asking others to consider whether there might be a different way forward, and the baby dragons seemed to understand the importance because they stayed close and quiet. On the 7th day, responses began arriving, and they were mixed because some people called Jake a traitor and Laura a deceiver, but others expressed cautious interest in hearing more, and that was enough to keep the experiment alive. Admiral Hayes authorized a meeting on a neutral station with representatives from both sides, and Jake and Laura would attend with the baby dragons and tell their story in person and answer questions, and try to plant seeds of possibility as they prepared to depart. Jake held Laura's hand and looked at the dragons who had grown so much in just days and represented hope in their very existence, and he thought about his brother and believed that maybe this was what honor really meant, not vengeance but choosing to break cycles of hatred and create something better for those who would come after.